one thing sticks in my mind on that day was the uniform branch officer who was 3 ranks above me was behind me in close proximity with his gun out. And I even think he had his gun cocked. So I had
behind you.
Behind me, I had a bit of an argument and told him to put his damn gun away. By 76, this time, there was a lot of turmoil in the police force. Godber had been arrested, Taffy Hunt had been arrested. There was a lot of station sergeants fled to Taiwan.
Yes.
There was a lot of arrests.
Yeah.
So the police force in general was in a state of
unrest.
Yes. There was even at one point a group of police officers attempted to break into the ICAC headquarters.
Sean Hotone, Dangerous Person 2.0, English channel.
Hi, welcome back again. I'm here with Chief Inspector Norman Mikhailov. Good day, Mikhailov. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Sean.
All right, very good. So today we're going to review a deadly robbery that occurred at Daisamyun Mahjong Hall, Castle Peak Road, I believe. Is that right?
That's right.
That's right, yes. Before we jump into the case itself, can you tell us what happens at Mahjong halls in the 1970s?
Oh, Mahjong halls. Well, Mahjong in the 1970s is probably my strongest memory of Hong Kong. As a young uniform patrol officer, the sound of Mahjong tiles getting shuffled around the table and getting banging and shouting and screaming, and it seemed like everyone was arguing, but they're not. They're just enjoying a game of Mahjong. And even in housing estates, in small flats, so many complaints of noise at night. But Mahjong was extremely popular in these times. And Mahjong schools, as we call them, were licensed premises, and there was a lot of them around Hong Kong. They charged commission. There was a legal limit on the stakes that people could play Mahjong, which was largely turned a blind eye to. But Mahjong schools were everywhere at that time, and a very strong part of my memory of my young days there.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah. So on 12th October 1976, this Mahjong parlor is robbed, and these are the following suspects.
Wang Yingchu, 23 years old, unemployed, approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, residing at Prince Edward Road. Philip Sanders, 27 years old, Portuguese nationality, unemployed, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, residing at Mei Fu Sun Chuan. Chan Ping Kun, 32 years old, truck driver, residing in Lao Foshan, was armed with a .22 caliber automatic pistol at the time of the incident and shot at police officer Choi Kwan Lei and staff member Chan Yuk Kon of the Mahjong parlor. Chan Wai Kun, also known as Chan Fuk Kun, 35 years old, construction site worker, living on Singshan Road, was holding a machete at the time of the incident. Chan Chi Hung, also known as Hung Jai, 25 years old, originally from the oyster farming community in Bowen County. After fleeing from the mainland to Hong Kong in 1972, he worked as a shipyard worker and later returned to the oyster farming business in Lao Foshan. Chan Kil, also known as Kiljai, Shorty Kil, and Do Yot Fu, aged 25 to 26, from Bowen County. His past occupations and residence were the same as those of Chan Chi Hung. He is skilled in cooking and was likely employed at a Dai Pai Dong, open-air food stall or restaurant at the time. The police have issued a wanted notice for his return.
We have these suspects, and there's been a robbery, and someone is killed. Officer Chow. Norman, what can you tell us about Officer Chow?
Choi Kun Loi. Choi Kun Loi was, I believe, 31 years old when he was killed. He had a couple of kids, young kids, and his wife at that time was in UK, applying for UK citizenship. So she had to live in the UK for a certain period. And one of my enduring memories of this particular case, and it's still stuck in my mind after all these years, is because this was my first case on being posted to Homicide Bureau. I just completed my first 3 years service, so I was on my way back from my first home leave to the UK, on my way back to Hong Kong. And I was at Heathrow Airport when I saw a woman in front of me in the queue at the immigration was in tears. She was Chinese, and the immigration officer at the desk was trying to communicate with her, but she couldn't speak very good English, a little bit broken English. But she was trying to tell the immigration officer that her husband was a police officer and he'd been killed in Hong Kong. So she had to immediately return to Hong Kong. So I interceded and I offered to help her and translate for the immigration officer. I explained that I was a police officer in Hong Kong. I was shocked to hear that this lady's husband had been killed, murdered on duty. So the immigration officer said that he was trying to explain to her that she, by leaving UK, she might it might badly affect her special visa to stay in the UK for I think 5 years to get the citizenship. So I gave the immigration officer a phone number of personnel, the head of personnel, who I knew very well, police personnel, to call to verify the information. And he thanked me, and he took the lady aside, and supervisor, took the lady aside. And I saw her again back in the just before boarding the plane to Hong Kong. And she told me that it had been resolved and she was fine in going back to Hong Kong. Little did I know, in these days, when we arrived in Hong Kong after leave, we had to report to the police post at Kai Tak Airport in the arrivals hall, where we'd get a letter, which would tell us where we were being posted. Now, after arriving, I went to the police post, picked up the letter, opened it, and I was being posted, to my delight, I was being posted to Homicide Bureau. So the following morning, I reported to Homicide Bureau on the 8th floor of Old May House, in police headquarters at that time. Not the huge police headquarters they have now. And reported to my new chief inspector, Charles Ng Yun Kay. And he had just taken over a case of the Dai Sam Yuen Mahjong case where Choi Kun Loy had been murdered. The funeral, I think, was held a couple of days later. And I attended the funeral with the whole team, and many other police officers attended. It was a large funeral. And I was quite shocked to find the deceased wife was in fact the same woman that I'd met at Heathrow Airport. So there's a strange coincidence, a fate, you might call it. But she recognized me. And anyway, I was assigned to that case. That was my first case in Hong Kong. So I have a pretty good recollection of it. In some parts I will never forget. Some parts I don't need the notes. Some parts I do.
So definitely a very sad day for this officer family and the Hong Kong police community. So what happened at the scene?
At the scene, Choi Kun Loy had gone to the Mahjong parlor. He knew the manager very well, and he was going to have dinner with the manager or some midnight snacks with the manager after the closing. It was just about to close, or had closed, and some robbers broke in, armed robbers. And Choi Kun Loy, all detectives in these days had to carry a firearm on or off duty. They had a personal issue firearm, and it was quite a burden. There's nothing romantic about carrying firearms. And he was armed, of course, with a .38, which is not the .38 special that they had later on. And they burst in, and he, of course, tried to defend the Mahjong school and pulled his own firearm out, and there was a gunfight. And unfortunately, I think he was shot. He was certainly shot in the head, and he was very, very seriously injured. The robbers ran off without actually robbing anything. They ran off after the gunfight. Choi was taken to hospital, where he died later that night. So then we had the murder case in our hands and the attempted robbery. As I say, it was my first case, so I was a rookie. The youngest one in Homicide Bureau. I think I was only 25 at that time. I was a youngster.
So what type of task force is assembled for this case? It's a robbery that's turned into a murder.
Well, Homicide Bureau was divided into 4 teams at that time.
Okay.
4 teams under a chief inspector, each team. So our team had the case. The bureau was fairly small. We only took on about 12 cases a year. Homicides were not that common in these days in Hong Kong compared to the UK or the United States. And we took on not domestic murders. We took on special cases, difficult cases, cases like police officers being murdered, firearms involved. Not simple domestic type cases which are easily solved. The local police would deal with them. So we all turned out. We would, all 4 teams, if they weren't dealing with any specific murder case, would turn out and would all work together.
Okay.
But our team was in charge of the case.
Okay.
And then once the first 48 hours are over, the others will go back and do their own investigations for their own cases. And we would settle down into the 48 hours. If you probably heard of the TV program, it's actually true. It's very, very crucial.
Okay.
So it involves forensics. It involves finding out, looking for witnesses. Don't forget, in these days, I'm talking about 48 years ago, we didn't have the plethora of CCTV. There was no CCTV. There were no cameras around. There were no mobile phones. So communications were not so easy. We relied on people on the street. So we had teams going around looking at the time of the robbery over several nights and weeks, who was around the streets at that time, and interviewing everyone, trying to find possible eyewitnesses.
Okay.
That sort of thing. At the same time, the detectives were contacting their informers. And we were looking into the background of, we didn't narrow investigations in these days, we kept it wide. So we're looking into, quite often, robberies involving a premises like that, there's some connection with employees or former employees. Eventually we narrowed down to a former employee that may have been involved. So we had a little kickstart a few weeks later. And that was developed through intelligence. When I say intelligence, I don't mean how clever we were. I mean criminal intelligence. Looking who were the contacts of this person who had worked there before that came under our scrutiny, and developing a picture.
When you say intelligence, like a tip line.
Yes,
That's part of it?
But we also had the Criminal Intelligence Bureau at that time, a separate bureau, who would specialize in gathering intelligence.
Okay.
Criminal intelligence of a general nature and specific nature. So we used them, of course, in a case like this. And we had our own detectives who had their own informers, who were fanning out, trying to get a tip on the case. I think there was a reward issued fairly quickly at that time. Was about, I think it was $20,000, which doesn't seem much nowadays, but at that time would be quite significant in being able to perhaps get some information from informers looking to make some money. So it was quite a good incentive. So we had quite a few tip-offs over the next few months.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the reward pulled in those tip-offs.
Yes.
And it led to.
Led to finding more information on the person who had previously been employed in the shop. And another piece of information which led to a tip-off on some of the group.
So did you participate in arresting some of these?
Yes, one of the Chans, I was tasked with leading a team to go and arrest him in a premises in Mongkok. It was believed he had a firearm, so I don't know why I was picked. I was a rookie. So I was the only officer on the team. But I had a very, very good team. The rank and file that I worked with were absolutely superb. And I'm still in touch with them to this day. Okay. So we turned up the address, and it was on a fairly large building in Mongkok, residential building, an old building. And as a precaution, I called emergency unit, the duty controller for the emergency unit, uniform branch emergency unit, and asked to get some manpower, low key, no blue lights and sirens, to come and just stand by. And as we did this raid. We didn't have battering rams or any special equipment that you might see in the movies and rushing in with guns blazing. We were pretty low key. If he was in there, he would be holed up. I think we were on something like the 10th or 12th floor, so he's not going to be jumping out the window. So the best approach is just knock on the door and tell him to come out. He knows we're waiting for him, and if he is armed, he'd be pretty foolish to come out with his firearm and start a firefight. So one thing sticks in my mind on that day was the uniform branch officer, who was 3 ranks above me, was behind me in close proximity with his gun out. And I even think he had his gun cocked. So I had
behind you?
Behind me. I had a bit of an argument and told him to put his damn gun away.
Okay, because you're in the crossfire if something happens.
Oh yeah. And we were all armed, but none of us had our guns out. Because it's in a very small location. If there was a gunfight, the chances of being shot by our own men were pretty high. Especially with someone with a cocked gun behind you. So I had a bit of an argument with that guy who was 3 ranks above me, but it was my raid, so I pulled my raid on him. I said, you do what you're told and get out of the way. Anyway, we knocked on the door and told him to open up, and we're coming in. So we went in, and he surrendered immediately. He was alone. And we did a search, and we found the gun. And it was a 2.2. But it was a very strange 2.2. It wasn't a gun as you might imagine. It was like a cigarette. We called them cigarette guns.
Cigarette guns. So how does that work?
How does that work? It's about the size of a packet of Winston. And if you remember the old cigarette lighters.
Yes.
It would open like that.
A flip.
A flip. And they're pretty narrow, probably about 2 centimeters. So a packet of Winston. Or what's the other cigarettes they had? Marlboro, it doesn't matter, but it's that size. We called them cigarette guns because of that. So you could put them in your shirt pocket like that. And they were .22 caliber. They were made in China. And the way they fired was they opened them up, put 3 bullets, 3 .22 bullets inside, shut it, and they had 3 triggers.
3 triggers.
Operated by, pull back the triggers which are on a spring, right? And they're very extremely dangerous. There's no safety catch. So if you had it in your shirt pocket there and you bumped against something, you're liable to get something blown off down below you or up above you with this thing.
You're going to shoot yourself.
You could be very, very easily. But our men and the uniform branch had come across quite a few of these on the streets doing stop and search. So we had an alert out at that time for the whole police force to be aware of these guns. So he had the .22 cigarette gun. Extremely dangerous little weapon, which could be lethal at short range.
Okay, but this is not the gun that was in the gunfight.
No.
Okay, so you still need to find.
Yeah, we never found that.
Okay, never found that. So how about the next suspect? You pull this guy in, you question him, interrogate him.
Yes, and then we get the other suspect.
Okay, so this leads to number 2.
It's like a domino.
Okay, and then there was a raid at a shipyard.
I didn't take part in that way,
Okay, you
but
didn't
there's a
take part in that.
shipyard in Aberdeen.
Okay, so we actually have 5 suspects in this case that were already identified. And one of them actually, 2 or 3 days before the robbery, they were casing the joint out. And one of them, at the time to go, he said, "I'm out," and he didn't go. 3 of the suspects are named Chan. So this one, also named Chan, he did not go. He backed out of the robbery. Can you tell us what happened to him? What role did he play as this unfolded?
Oh, I remember him very well because he lived in our homicide bureau on the 8th floor. He became a witness, an informant witness. So we had him under protective custody.
Okay.
Not in a jail, not in a police station, but in an office in our homicide bureau.
Okay.
So every day I would see him with his toothbrush and whatever.
Okay.
A very strange situation.
I see.
and,
Nice guy?
I wouldn't say he was a nice guy, but he
Okay.
behaved himself when he was in homicide bureau.
Yeah, I
He
would
was on
think.
best behavior.
I would think, yeah, with all those policemen there. So, okay, so you've got at least one suspect you've personally arrested. You have one that's turned, he's helping you out. And then our research shows that on March 18th, a police report comes out on television. In essence, an ambush is set to go after the suspect, Chang Zihong.
Chan Ji-hong.
Chen Zihong. Now, is he the shooter?
Yes.
So this is the guy you really want.
Yeah.
Okay, so this happened at Aberdeen.
Yes.
Aberdeen Stockyard, and the report said that everyone, the workers that were all there, are kind of thrown in shock when the police come in.
Yes.
It seems like a heavy-duty raid this time.
It was a heavy duty raid. I wasn't on it,
Okay.
but I remember him being brought back, and he still had the scar because he was shot by the police officer,
Okay.
Choi Kun Loy,
All right.
and he had quite a visible scar on his stomach.
Okay. What I'm getting is the mahjong schools or parlors were kind of social gatherings, setting type areas. Can you add a bit more to this?
Well, first of all, they're not schools.
Okay.
They were prolific in Hong Kong in the 70s and into the 80s as well. Some of them were quite plush, some of them pretty dingy, but they're gambling parlors, basically. They're licensed, probably not as strictly regulated as they should be because they're limited. I can't remember the exact figures, but the actual stakes is limited per player. They run on commission, a bit like poker.
Okay.
Is operated in a casino.
Okay.
The players gamble against each other, not against the house.
Okay.
So the house takes a commission
Okay.
from the pot.
Sure.
But another thing I think you need to know is that there were quite a few robberies of mahjong parlors in these times. If you put it from a robber's perspective, which I always like to do if I'm looking for a robber, I try to think like a robber. It's a closed environment. Once you're in and shut the door,
Yeah.
right, you can turn the blinds down, and you've got a captive audience
Yes,
or
okay.
captive victims
Right.
because you're armed and they're not. And people who they're carrying a fair bit of cash for the stake, they don't gamble on credit. There's cash,
Yeah.
right? And watches. There's usually quite a few ladies there. Ladies like to play mahjong, so ladies have handbags with money and probably a bit of gold in there.
Sure.
So there's quite a bit of money in these mahjong parlors. So we had quite a spate of robberies in mahjong parlors.
So you know.
Sometimes not to rob the parlor, but to rob the people in the parlor,
Okay.
the customers.
Sure, sure. So in the Chinese press, they actually said the officer was a friend of the manager, who also happened to be named Chan. So he's there with his weapon, and he's actually not on duty. Now in the States, they say a police officer is on duty 24/7. What was he doing there at 2 o'clock? The report says that he was waiting for the manager for them to go out to some dim sum. What else was he doing there?
Well, as far as I'm aware, that's what he was doing. He was there to meet the manager, who was his friend, and go out for some late night snacks. I have nothing to overturn that.
Okay.
But I must say that you mentioned in the States, police officer on duty 24 hours. The uniform branch are on duty or off duty,
Okay.
right? The CID, the Criminal Investigation Department, they carry personal issue firearms. So you could argue that they're on duty 24 hours a day because these firearms are carried with them on duty or off duty. They take them home.
Yeah.
So my way of handling it was to always take the ammunition out, put that in one place, and put the gun in another place.
Okay.
But carrying these weapons off duty is an absolute burden, particularly in the summer and the heat. It's horrible. And we wore Hawaiian shirts in these days, so you could always see the detective with a bulge in his hip,
Okay.
which was a .38 gun. Anyway, but in this particular case, to argue whether he's on and off duty is really not a very good argument because he was there at that time with his gun. Whether he's on or off duty is quite irrelevant. The fact is, when the robbers came in, he became on duty when he drew his firearm to defend whoever was there against these armed robbers.
Yeah. So now when
He could have.
Sure. But anyway, the 24-hour example is that if you're a police officer, let's say you're not on the clock, but you see a crime happening, you can't just walk away from it.
No, you're duty bound to take action.
Okay, so that's what I mean by 24/7. Okay, if something's going wrong, you need to step up. You know, that's the type of life one signs up for when you're a policeman. So, so anyway, this gentleman, this officer, he stepped up, got into a serious gunfight. He fired 6 times, I believe. One of the Chanks fired 5 shots. The perpetrator was hit in the stomach, and unfortunately, the police officer was hit in the head.
Yeah.
And the manager was also hit, but he survived later. The officer was brought to the hospital. I don't know, did he pass right away or?
I understand he passed away a few days later.
A few days later. So this is a very sad day for Hong Kong and the police community. So how do your fellow police gather around the family of the officer? You mentioned how you had met the widow on the plane before you were even signed to the case. Did you ever see her again?
Yes, at the funeral.
At the funeral?
Yeah.
So the police pay for everything at the funeral?
Yes, we had a very well developed police welfare bureau, an actual bureau. For example, I was injured on duty many years later, and taken to hospital, and within an hour, the police welfare bureau officers were there at the bedside. They'd set up television. They were very good. Now, obviously, and you probably have the same experience in the States, but when a police officer is killed on duty, the whole police force gathers around.
Yes.
Which is quite a natural thing to do.
Yes.
To support the family, to do everything they can to give as much support as possible. So in this case, all the funeral expenses, of course, were covered. He was killed on duty. That goes without saying. Yeah. But I don't know exactly how the Welfare Bureau assisted the family, but they would have given huge assistance.
Okay.
From schooling, from arranging all kinds of things for the family, which is natural and proper.
Yeah, I also heard they raised at least $8,500 just for the widow in those days and took care of the kids.
I believe so. I wasn't directly involved in these things. Like you, I read in the newspapers, newspaper reports of how this was done. But having been involved in several other cases later on in years of police officers being murdered, it was the same experience. The force gathers round, which is only natural.
Okay. And do you have an extra zest, an extra zeal to go after the people who killed a fellow soldier or member?
For me, it's a murder. We have the zeal for any murder victim.
Okay.
But of course, when a fellow police officer is murdered, the inference is that we need to catch. It's someone who kills a police officer,
Yes.
knowing that that's a police officer.
Yes. Otherwise, you all have targets on your back.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
It must have been quite plain to these people that Choi Kun Loy, when he drew his gun, that he wasn't a robber. They were the robbers. So the only people lawfully entitled to carry a weapon are the CID officers off duty
Okay.
in
Now,
plain clothes.
sure. Now, you mentioned earlier about how you were leading a raid in Kowloon as you arrested one of these suspects, and he had a cigarette gun.
Yes.
So, and we mentioned how unsafe these guns could be. You could
Yes.
end up shooting yourself. Yeah. So, did you find out where he got the gun from?
He said that he got it from a seaman.
Okay, and his purpose obviously was.
He's a robber, but of course he didn't say I did it to do a robbery because it wasn't used in this particular robbery. And as far as we are aware, that's the only robbery he was actually involved in.
Okay.
But you can assume that he didn't want such a dangerous thing as a souvenir.
Yes. Okay.
Because I mean, it's prison time, serious prison time for possession of a firearm. Right?
Sure.
in
Yeah,
Hong
in
Kong.
Hong Kong. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. So he's arrested, and interrogation starts. And during the course of this interrogation, the Hong Kong police put out a Hong Kong police report, trying to get leads from the public.
Yes.
And there's a TV enthusiastic Hong Kong police viewer who calls in with some information that leads to identifying where Chan Ping is. Chan Ping Hung is the shooter, and this led to a raid in Aberdeen Aberdeen Docks. A big raid, caught everyone by surprise. So now you've caught him, and after he's caught, you find out some things that happened in October, shortly after the funeral of the officer. And this was basically Chan Ping had been shot in the stomach, and he went with his friend Chang Wai. These are the two robbers who went inside, and they held up at Chang Wai's small apartment, and they're watching on TV to get any news. And so this 2 or 3 days, the news comes out that the officer has succumbed to his fatal injuries. When that happens, they go toss the gun. This is the weapon that kills the police officer.
Yeah, it was dumped in a public toilet.
So you recovered that.
It was recovered not by us. It was recovered by the police who reported it. And
Okay.
It was handed over to us, but I think it was left in a cistern
Okay.
in the
this-
toilet. Yeah.
Oh, in the basin behind the.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So now you have at least 3 people arrested. One is the one you arrested. The other one was Chan Ping, and I believe Chang Wai was arrested walking his dog somewhere. So they're brought to court. What do you remember? What were the charges for these 3?
Murder, possession of firearms, conspiracy to murder, a whole raft of different charges.
Okay.
We don't normally follow the American system where we throw all the charges from,
Whatever you can
from
get.
murder down to cruelty to a dog or whatever.
Yeah.
Throw everything at them. We try to keep it simple for the jury, so they can decide on principally the murder case. Possession of firearms. Quite often we don't charge that separately because it's already part of the murder charge.
Yeah.
If the firearm's been used for a murder.
Yeah. So we have the murderer, Chan Ping Hung, death sentence, right?
Yes.
Okay, and gets commuted.
Yes. Well,
Okay.
that's quite normal in Hong Kong because the death sentence was still on the statute books.
Yes.
So the judges, when someone is convicted of murder in these days, they would put the black cap on and pronounce the only sentence which by law they are entitled to pronounce, which is death by hanging. It's quite a dramatic scene in the court
Yeah, I can imagine.
when
yeah.
they put the black cap on. But of course, we know that it will eventually be commuted to life sentence,
Okay.
which in some cases is life.
Did you ever see the widow again after the funeral?
No, I try to avoid keeping contact with family and generally speaking, in murder cases, because
You bring back too many memories.
yeah, they see my face, it brings back horrible memories.
Yeah. Okay. I get it. I get
in
it.
one way or another. But
Sure.
so I try and avoid keeping contact with families in these circumstances.
So before we wrap this up, Norman, can you tell me your experience with any other robberies or murders that occurred in mahjong parlors?
Yes, not long after this case, I was involved in another case where a police officer was killed in very, very similar circumstances.
And this didn't you get a commendation in this case?
Yes,
You did, from the governor,
yes.
for a job well done.
Yes.
Okay, so what happened when the police officer was killed?
Simply, he was killed with a bullet directly through the forehead by the robber, one shot. And very similar circumstances.
Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of these times these police officers are protectors or guardians, and then they're forced into becoming on duty when the robbers come in. Or...
I don't know if you're inferring that there might have been...
like on the American system when a police officer can work at it.
No, I understand. I've been to America several times and I've seen police officers off duty, but on duty being paid by the
bar.
establishment,
Yes.
whatever that they're looking after,
Yes.
in uniform in many
Yes.
cases.
Right.
That's allowed in the United States, but in Hong Kong, it's not allowed.
Okay.
In this particular case, Choi Kun Loy was there to meet the manager, who was a friend of his, and go out for supper. Whether or not he was perhaps protecting in the sense of being there with a firearm as an asset, I don't know.
Okay.
I have no evidence of that. But
anyway, 6 months later, this happens again.
yeah, and that was the case.
Okay.
Yeah, but that case, without going into too much details here, we don't have time.
Yeah.
That involved corruption. Don't forget, this was the 70s. The ICAC, Independent Commission Against Corruption, had been formed, I believe, in 73, which is the year I joined the police. And by 76, this time, there was a lot of turmoil in the police force. Godber had been arrested,
Yes.
Kathy Hunt had been arrested.
Yeah.
There was a lot of station sergeants fled to Taiwan.
Yes.
There was a lot of arrests.
Yeah.
So the police force in general was in a state of
Unrest.
unrest.
Yes.
There was even at one point a group of police officers attempted to break into the ICAC headquarters.
It got so bad that didn't the governor have to issue an amnesty?
Eventually they issued an amnesty. I'm not quite sure the terms of the amnesty. But it didn't stop further arrests for many, many years to come. It took probably, I would say, probably 10 years of hard work, not only by the ICAC, but by police headquarters and policies and increasing pay. It took at least 10 years. So by the time in the early 80s, the Hong Kong police were probably the best paid police force in the world.
Okay.
My salary, for example, as a young chief inspector or superintendent later on, was equivalent to the, bear in mind the tax differences and the allowances that we had. For example, we could send a child overseas to public school and the government would pay 75% of that, the school fees.
Sweet.
Plus the airfares. So
Yeah,
we
okay.
were really well looked after. And a lot of that, I believe, was due to a huge effort to clean up the police force. And one way to do that is to pay them decently
Sure.
and get better recruitment standards. In my early days in the police force, some of the police officers could hardly read or write. They had very little education. But 10 years later, we had police constables at entry level who had bachelor's degrees
Spoke multiple languages.
and spoke multiple languages, and the officers would generally require minimum of a university degree. So it was a very, very different place for us. But it took at least 10 years to clear out the riffraff.
Okay. Well, I think that is definitely an episode by itself. The AC's fight against corruption. You just covered a whole decade.
Oh,
So it's definitely an episode by itself. So we'll leave it at that, and I'll just wrap it up. If you like it, share, subscribe, comment, like. Cheers.